Just imagine you're at Disneyland right now. You're approaching the hub and you turn left to cross the bridge into Adventureland. As you cross the bridge, you see Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki room on your left. Do you decide to enter? If your answer was no, I'm sure it will change to yes by the end of today's episode, as you'll have a much greater appreciation for this attraction. Joining me is Ken Bruce, author of Before the Birds Sang Words. In his book, Ken deep dives into the history of this attraction that has Walt's hands all over it. Ken makes his case as to why it's one of the most important attractions inside a Disney park and why it should always remain. Plus, we get into the rich history of this attraction and dispel some rumors that have been touted for years. Join me and Ken as we discuss Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room.
It's time to dive into today's Disney dialogue.
Hello, Ken, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast. How you doing today?
Hey, Jeff, thank you so much for having me. This is going to be fun. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm excited to have this conversation because your book, Before the Birds Sang Words, is a deep dive, and I mean a deep dive, into Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. And I just want to start with, the question of all the attractions from all the Disney parks. Why write a book about Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room?
It changed everything as far as the history of the park. It changed the tone of the park. It changed the technology of the park. It influenced so many attractions at Disneyland later on, as well as the entire theme park industry. It's the most important attraction there. How's that for an answer?
Well, for the next hour, we will have that conversation and see what the listeners think to that answer. But I will start with just I feel like a lot of Disney fans have a basic kind of assumption, and there are some myths related to this attraction. I think they go to, Walt initially being inspired by a wind-up bird figurine, which we'll get into and discuss whether or not that's actually the first inspiration. You always hear that the Enchanted Tiki Room birds are the first audio animatronics figures. We'll get into that.
Oh, we've got a lot to talk about.
We have a ton to talk about. Yeah. And this was originally conceived as a restaurant. So that was kind of my knowledge, my limited knowledge. And I knew more little factoids, but that's, I think, where a lot of people start, audio animatronics, bird figurine, restaurant. And let's just start with a couple of really fun facts, because this was the first fully automated theatrical presentation appearing in an amusement venue, which is, these days we get them at Chuck E. Cheese's, but
they're everywhere.
They're everywhere, but this was the first. And I think it's really hard for us modern day folks to walk into it and thinking about that. It's pretty remarkable.
There is no doubt the Tiki Room is a very quaint, old-fashioned show at Disneyland. But it's the most consequential thing there. And we today, our audiences today, might be a little jaded. People leave in the middle of the show still to this day. And that's the sort of thing that always annoyed me, because I thought there's a history of this thing that if people understood and heard, they'd stick around. That was probably the biggest impetus to write the book, was to remind people how important that attraction is for the history of Disneyland and the history of theme parks in general. And to open their eyes to a new kind of wonder about it, that it still is magical. It still is enchanted. The technology is clunky, but there's a story to be told, and it's a really good story.
So a couple things on that. Number one, the technology is not that clunky, in my opinion, because guess what? It doesn't break down the way Indiana Jones does. The show runs,
Yes, yeah.
So in that sense, it works. And I will fully, this is not a BS brown nosing answer. After finishing this book, was the next time I'm in Disneyland, I am definitely going to the Enchanted Tiki Room. And to be fair, it actually hasn't been that long since I've done it. A couple times ago I was there, I went in, but it is certainly not a must-do attraction when I go to Disneyland.
Yeah, it's a show. So once you see the show, you're like, I've seen it, but if you change your mindset a little. There's a lot more layers.
Yes, and a completely new appreciation for it. So thank you. It really is a great book. This was also the first ticketed Disneyland attraction to sport its own original theme song, which, is kind of a staple these days. And I should say it was a staple at one point. I feel like that's kind of gone away, and we're kind of going back toward that. Tiana's Bayou Adventure just got a new song written for it, but I mean, the Enchanted Tiki Room without that song which we'll get into at one point, it wasn't part of that attraction, but yeah, so good. And then it was also the first time Walt Disney deliberately affixed his name to an attraction because he bankrolled this from his personal account. So those are just some really fun facts to start right there.
But beyond that, it was also an incredibly personal attraction to Walt in general. He wasn't as deeply involved in productions back at the studio, not then and not for years earlier. This one was lighting his fire, and he was all over it. And it is such a personal reflection of the man. So, yes, his affixing his name was because he paid for it, but it was also because it was so Walt. If you want to know Walt, go see that show. You'll see his sensibility all over it.
And I honestly didn't realize that his name has been attached to it since the beginning. I honestly thought it was added on years later as a tribute, as I believe Walt Disney's Carousel of Progress. That's how that worked out. His name was later added.
He was affixing his name to all of the attractions at the New York World's Fair, which was happening at the same time as the Tiki Room was enjoying its first year run. So. Yeah. Yeah, so it was on his mind. It's like he was totally into these attractions, so he's going to put his name on it.
And before it was Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, it had a bunch of different names. And this, I'm going to go through this list of names, and this will give listeners kind of an idea of how much change this attraction went through. And what was the length of time that they were actually working on it?
Well, I'm going to say 2+ years, 3 years of, from conception to finished product, 2+ years. I need to do. That's the thing about writing a book. The moment you write down the fact, you never remember it again. But yeah, it was about 2+ years. Yeah.
So it started with the name Birds, followed by Bird Symphony, Bird Room, Bird Cafe, Bird Restaurant. See, we're going in a direction there. Tropical Restaurant, Polynesian Restaurant, Polynesian Terrace, Tiki Birds, Tiki Room, Legend of the Enchanted Tiki, Enchanted Tiki and Bird Room, Stouffer's Enchanted Tiki and Bird Room. We'll get into that. And Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, of course, is what it ended up with. Interestingly, the name Tiki Room was the name of a restaurant in Pennsylvania. So Disney added the word enchanted, which was a really...
Restaurant / bowling alley.
Bowling alley, that's right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this wind-up bird that we hear so much about that still to this day sits in Walt's office at the Walt Disney Studios lot. This is kind of the story that the company tells of this bird that he bought.
So Jeff, one of the biggest fuels under my hiney to write the book was to tear apart these myths. They're very, very frustrating, and they're the happy, joyful, easy to swallow sort of stories that get started and then they just never die. The Disney fan universe, just goes nuts. And I have a feeling I know where the first one came from. There's so many myths that I enjoyed breaking apart, and they're frustrating because the myths are cute, but the actual story is so much more interesting. It's a little bit more, it's a lot more complicated, but it's always more interesting. Yeah, and that first one is the story that got started about, Walt Disney in 1947 is in New Orleans with his wife, and he goes into an antique store, sees a cute little wind-up bird in a gilded cage. And from there, for no apparent reason, the Tiki Room is born. That's not the way it happened, not by a long shot. It's cute, and yes, he loved that bird, and yes, he did ask his people to break it apart and try to figure out how it worked, but not for the Tiki Room initially, for his Disneylandia project, which was a whole other side project Walt had that never got going. He loved mechanical toys of all types, not just that bird. He liked toys of all types. And he saw other mechanical birds far, far before he saw that little mechanical bird in a cage that he responded to. one in Alsace, France, when he was 17-year-old in the war. That was part of a mechanical clock in a cathedral. That one he loved just as much. That was an animated rooster. But that's not the truth. Those birds did not lead to Jose and his pals at Disneyland. It was a much more complex story.
I do feel like a lot of times these myths were created by Walt himself, though. I mean, we have that famous interview of him talking about dreaming of Disneyland, sitting on the park bench in Griffith Park, watching his daughters on the merry-go-round.
Walt was a storyteller, but I don't think that was one. I have a feeling that it was Dave Smith back at the archives who loved to tell that story. Walt had of course, so when you're, the archivist at Disney, you see these mechanical birds that Walt loved and you go, well, that's got to be the link to animatron. Well, the Tiki Room. It is a link. That those birds were a link to audio animatronics for sure, but not to the Tiki Room specifically.
And let's talk about this movement that was kind of happening in America, this passion for all things tiki that started soon after Disneyland opened. And I mean, Tiki Mania was going on. We had places like Don the Beachcomber. And you want to talk a little bit about that whole movement?
Well, actually, I'm going to go back. I actually break it into two chapters, one called Tropical Hideaways and one called Tiki Rooms, because they're totally different sort of movements. America's passion for all things exotic and far away and island-inspired goes all the way back to the 20s and 30s, when the most popular music in America at the time was Hawaiian music. That blew my mind. I had to triple check that one, but it was true. Americans loved all things exotic. And that led to watering holes, and then come World War II with, our boys overseas in the South Seas, both going through the worst experience of their life and the most magical at the same time because the islands had never been seen before. They carried that love of an enchantment for those islands home as well. And that led slowly but surely into the sort of pop tiki culture that we know today, which was fun and fanciful and joyful and naive and weird and daffy and all about, suburban dad being able to go to a room somewhere in town that transported him or her or them to somewhere else other than cement suburbia, all about fountains and beautiful exotic women and palm trees and all that. So, and that's when the tiki became part of the culture, the tiki figure. And tiki then became the word that referenced that sort of silly movement in the 1950s and early part of the 60s. So Disneyland was just catching up with that trend. That was also fueled by, the Hawaii becoming our next state of the union, and that captivated Americans as well. So yeah, it was going to happen. Disneyland, Adventureland was going to have some part of it that exuded that tiki pop world, but without alcohol.
But without alcohol. That's right. Now, Adventureland at this time was kind of messy, to say the least. We had this plantation restaurant and this poster alley and this pavilion restaurant.
Yeah, it was all of Disneyland. It was all of Disneyland, Jeff, not just Adventureland. The whole place was trying to figure out what it was for years.
And in 1962, Adventureland construction was all over the place. We're getting a new Jungle Cruise boathouse. We're getting the Swiss Family Robinson treehouse. We're getting facades along Adventureland's main thoroughfare. So,
yes.
I know these days I think about the amount of construction going on in Disney parks all the time, and it's kind of frustrating to me, to be completely honest. But obviously, you need to have construction.
And Walt would disagree with you. Walt loved it when there was construction because that meant they were fixing his park. The park was, they weren't going to tell you these stories, but no, the park wasn't ready to open when it opened in 1955. It still needed a handful of more years. So when those things were happening, when the hard hats were on and the walls were up, that was Walt's park becoming better. And Walt loved it. Walt loved that.
Yeah, I get it. I also don't love construction walls.
Of course. Yeah, because it takes away from the theming, the immersion.
Let's talk about the pavilion bandstand for a little bit, because when this went away, essentially, it kind of made way for a bird-filled cafe.
That there are so many different tributaries that go into the Tiki Room, and one was the trigger that launched the Pavilion restaurant, which was actually one food place that shared Adventureland side and Main Street side. So the first side of the building was all Victorian gingerbread, and the other side was, palm thatch and all that Adventureland grass skirting. And it wasn't two restaurants, it was one. You walked in through Main Street and you were dumped out on to, the shores of the Jungle Boat ride. So it was thematically just a nightmare. The bandstand was one of the triggers that allowed it was actually Disneyland Inc. at the time to sound the alarm. Like, this is messy. We need to fix this. The bandstand was just, there was no bandstand back there. There was just some performers, a duo or a trio playing Hawaiian music while you watched, the boats come in on unthemed furniture. They needed a bigger bandstand. That didn't work, so they added another that was such a beautifully themed show performed by the Royal Tahitians that it was really clear that going in through Main Street to this new show made no sense. So that was when they took this one building, put a wall in the middle of it, and created two restaurants. And then with the idea that they would also have an intimate little tea room / cafe to bridge the seam. There was a giant seam that you would see as you walked into Adventureland of this building that was not pretty. It was awkward. The seam being the roof lines changing from, the gingerbread to the thatch. So there were so many different parts of that the story of that building is all about how to fix it. And one of the fixes, the Tiki Room was a Band-Aid initially. And it was a Band-Aid before it was the Enchanted Tiki Room. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because I feel like, I've taken a good number of behind the scenes tours at the Disney parks, and I feel like that's something that's always brought up is the transition from one land to another. Yes. And how it is seamless and how, the music, although it might be different in each of the lands, they're on like the same beat or in the same key so that it's not an awkward, weird transition. And in the sense of what you're talking about, it was a visually strange transition, which is equally as important to them.
It is the opposite of seamless. There was a seam. There literally was a seam. And that was the learning curve that they were all having when they were walking, when the people who, the movie people that were walking along with Walt every Saturday morning at Disneyland were learning. They were learning then. That idea of sort of seamless transitions was not something that popped out in 1955 when the park opened. They were learning it as they went. And the Pavilion complex was one such issue where they needed to figure out a way as you're walking from one area to the other for it to be like a movie cross dissolve. And the Tiki Room was part of that. So many different ways the Tiki Room came to be, and that is one of them.
And when they were developing the idea of this cafe, I know John Hench's original sketch was really important. And it was a 4-winged room design, which still exists to this day in the attraction. And a lot of this original sketch has stuck. I mean, the attraction has gone through a ton of changes, but that original sketch, I mean, if you were to look at it, you'd see the resemblance today.
Yeah, that is the sketch that accidentally launched the Tiki Room because on one hand, it was his sketch of the interior of the Tiki Room was not that different at all from other sketches of interiors for Tiki establishments coast to coast. However, what he did was just for fun, he added some birds in the rafters and not having any idea that would become a conversation when he pitched the sketch. Because Walt saw those birds and said, "What are you thinking, John? We can't have birds in a cafe." Why, Walt? Because they're going to poop on the food. I'm sure Walt didn't use that specific word either. And John, thinking fast, because he was terrified of Walt, said, No, Walt, they're not real birds. They're stuffed birds. And that was another contention for Walt. He did not believe in taxidermy at his park. He had tried that before, and it was too ghoulish. He was like, the idea of real live skinned animals being part of the animatronics that he was creating, or the figures that he was creating, was repugnant to him eventually. So he was like, John, we don't do fake birds, stuffed birds, and put them in a restaurant. And then John, again, trying to figure out a way out, said, oh, no, they're mechanical birds. And Walt perked up. All of his love of mechanical toys from his childhood on, he was like, we can do that. We can do that. Let's do that. And so the Tiki Room was born right there and kept growing and growing and growing. It was a small idea. Even then, with the idea of little birds that tweet as you're eating your food, tweeting back and forth to each other, no, we can do better than that. And so it just kept growing into a more audacious and more ridiculous free-for-all performance.
Since you brought it up, I want you to tell the taxidermy story, because Walt had used taxidermy, semi-recently in the Grand Canyon diorama that's part of the train ride at Disneyland. And it was something about Walt actually finding a carcass.
Oh, yeah, and it stems from that. It was, he was in the staff shop, and the staff shop is where they make all the molds and of the figures. And he opened the refrigerator and saw the skinned carcass of a coyote in there, which is terrifying. And he was told that that's, just the leftover remains of the coyote that they had skinned so that they could put a skin on a coyote, probably for the mine train ride. And Walt was like, then and there, like, we need to stop doing that. Like, no more. Let's just use synthetic skins. No more of that. And they did that. And it might have been in the Grand Canyon diorama as well, but it actually probably was. So that's where it came from. Just Walt stumbling upon a skinned carcass in a company refrigerator. And he was like, no, let's not do that anymore. We don't, the people that come to Disneyland don't want to think we're killing animals for the sake of their fun. So that put an end to that.
One of the things that really surprised me that I read, and I don't know why I'd never thought of this before, but the original intention was never to have the birds sing. In fact, the title of your book, Before the Birds Sang Words. It was always just going to be like tweets and chirps.
And it remained that way for a long time.
And what it made me think of initially was when you think of original Jungle Cruise, where Walt really wanted things to be taken seriously and based in reality. Yeah. And that is not really where they ended up. When they decided to have them talk, the show went from dreamlike and eerie to something zany and comical. And Adventureland in general was transforming from like a true life adventure to a fantasy based on nature, but styled for drama.
So I think initially the people were thinking, okay, this is a restaurant and we don't want to, no one was thinking of a show. They were thinking of something that just was an experience, a happening. You're dining and the birds start to tweet back to each other and, oh, how adorable. And, oh, maybe that's followed by some tiki grumbling or whatever. So it was always with the patrons of the restaurant in mind, but it got out of hand. It got cuckoo out of hand. But for the longest time, it was just performance art. So it was just 3 acts, and the birds weren't singing words. They were just tweeting and cawing, and the orchids would come down and they would just make some weird ooh-ah noises. They didn't have words either. The totems were just grunting. It was just a happening. It was pure performance art. Not that different from what I guess the Rainforest Cafe eventually did. The Rainforest Cafe does not put on a show; just things happen. That was the earliest idea. But knowing Walt, it was like, well, if we can do that, why can't we do that? And if we can do that, why can't we do that? And eventually, the show became, a grandiose 3-act bacchanal without the opening number that was really, really impressive and really grandiose, but it made no sense and it was frightening. Again, imagine you're eating, it goes through the whole 3 acts, and ends with the war chant where the totems are screaming, the birds are shrieking, the lightning and thunder, end of show. And then the lights come up and you're expected to, leave the restaurant. It was very clear that despite it being really impressive, it was terrifying, like kind of unnerving. So that's when Walt, kind of later in the game, goes, we have to shape this into something that really does feel like a show with MCs, something that sets the tone, which was and tells audience, the people watching this thing, what they're in for. Yeah, but it was a piece of weird, scary performance art for the longest time before Walt was like, we have to shapeshift this. Yeah.
Before we get into kind of the newer design of the show and the whole restaurant experience, I want to talk a little bit about audio animatronics.
That's a rabbit hole. Oy.
Yeah, well, even just a couple episodes. I did a whole episode on audio animatronics with somebody from Imagineering, and it is widely speculated that the Tiki Room birds are the first audio animatronics, but the reality is that term first appeared in Vacationland magazine in the fall of 1960 in reference to Nature's Wonderland attraction. I mean, that's well before the Enchanted Tiki Room opened. So,
right, I can walk you through that. And I think I can do it reasonably quickly, because audio animatronics. Why is that word audio in there to begin with? It all starts with a nagging limitation, a simple nagging limitation that engineers had with the figures, both in the Jungle Cruise and then later in the very, very elaborate Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland, which is, when a coyote or a raven or any other animal makes a noise, how can we sync that with their mouths? It's that simple. How do we do that? And the answer was really actually very simple. The Disneys came up with it. It was basically if you can imagine that dial that goes back and forth when you are recording audio and you see it go into the red. Imagine every time it goes into the red, it triggers a movement. That would be the mouth of the figure. So with a simple solenoid, they were able to figure out a way to have audio itself, the audio of the figure, the bark or the whatever, the oink, the actual recorded sound of the figure triggered the mouth movement. And that's why it was called audio animatronics. And others had come to the idea before the Imagineers had. In fact, the lawyers were wise to say, you know what, before we patent this, let's see if anybody else has come up with the idea. And they looked in and found out that someone actually had come up with the idea, August Brackensee in England. And he had been using it to animate a mouth for a head that was used for signage for his electrical company. And he was happy to you want to take the patent? Sure. You can have it. And he was very kind to them.
For $70,000.
I think it wasn't 70. I think it was less. Well, whatever. He was like, I'll take the money and run.
And then the government patent was 17,000.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So whatever's in my book, it's there. However, the lovely people who made, Thunderbirds Go, the English group there, they'd already been using that technology for their puppets, to flap the mouths of their puppets so that the puppeteers didn't have to do that, which allowed them to pre-record an entire puppet show. And, all the puppeteers had to do was act to the pre-recorded sound. So it was a simple idea. Now, Audio Animatronics 2.0, that was an entirely new patent that quickly was just based on the idea of wait a minute, if we can actually have the pre-recorded sound of a raven caw, flip a solenoid to open a raven's beak, why can't we have other sounds off stage trigger all the other movements? Not as easy as it sounds, but once you talk to the lovely people in our Defense Department who had already figured out a way to do that, you have a path forward to create something as elaborate as the Tiki Room.
And what was the government using this for? Disney ended up buying that patent for $17,000, but what was the government using it for?
It was their missile program, specifically the Polaris missile system. So that technology you'd be able to record a bunch of blips and bleeps on audio tape that where each individual tone would trigger a separate movement at precisely the right time. So that was useful for launching missiles or rockets. But specifically, the equipment that Disney people took away because it was quickly not useful to the government. They had already started to invent even better ways of triggering movement, was used for a gantry that could move on, that you could record the motions of the ocean on and play them back. The idea being is you could mount a missile on that you could test launch based on where it was in space, because it would be on the ocean. These were missiles that were launched from subs that were submerged in water. So being able to test it on these gantries, was very useful. And these gantries were much like the things that rock the Star Tours vehicles. They could record the movement and play it back. So when Disney Imagineers saw that, and they would see it in articles right in Popular Science, wow, you can actually record movement and play it back. Sign me up. That was exactly what they needed at exactly the right time. And if you account for the amount of money that the Defense Department poured into figuring out how to do that, that easily makes the Enchanted Tiki Room at Disneyland the most the most expensive attraction, certainly up to that time, for sure.
And all of these sounds and stuff were just being recorded on magnetic tape, which if you grew up in the 80s and 90s, that's basically the same type of tape that was in your musical cassette tape. So
yes. And there was a lovely instrument called a tone reed that would vibrate to a specific, very specific amplitude. So you'd have to have a series of different ones of these tone reeds that only triggered when they heard that tone. So you record those tones on audio tape, and when these tone reeds hear them, they will tilt a head on a Tiki Room bird, or they will tilt an entire body or turn a head left or right. So working with these tone reeds and recording the blips and bleeps on audio tape, you can create, with a good deal of patience, an entire performance. And then those blips and bleeps would also run the lighting and the effects and turn left or right perches and lower bird mobiles and do all of that, all on audio tape.
And all of that is stored essentially in the basement of the Walt
Yes.
Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. So a massive room full of magnetic tape and tubes and all this stuff.
It's different now. Now you can actually run the show, with an Apple Watch if you want. Mm-hmm. But I have been told that the air system, the compressed air that runs the Tiki Rooms, is still down there. The original machinery. Someone needs to let me down there. I need to figure out what's down there. But yeah, you don't need audio tape anymore, of course. You can run the show with the blips and bleeps on a tiny little hard drive.
One of the things that kind of blew my mind is that these tiki birds needed to be animated in one take, which is remarkable. Folks, if you're listening, as I said a couple episodes ago, I chatted with Ethan Reed, a former Imagineer who used to animate these characters. And he certainly didn't do it in one take. We talked through the entire process.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So why did they have to be done in one take back then? And holy crap, I can't believe they did it.
Why? Because they just didn't have the technology to layer these things. They quickly made a machine come Lincoln and later, where they could layer on movements. They could do an arm first and then record a new layer on top of that. It was a new technology. So they had to blip and bleep the heck out of the audio tape in one go. Now, they didn't have to do all the figures all at once. They could do one figure at a time. But it's a process. Yeah, and if they screwed up, they had to start over again. But, the upside, there are two upsides. One is, the mouths are already taken care of because that's still the solenoid process that I already mentioned. So the audio of the birds is going to do that. But as far as the pitch and turn and heads up and heads down, that had to be done in one go. And then the other upside is, since it was a 4-quadrant room and you only needed to record for the birds of 1/4 of the room and then rubber stamp them on the other 3. That was a great way to save time and money. And it was the only way to do it because they didn't have enough real estate on the audio tape to do all 200 and some odd figures. If you really want to be nerdy, take a look at one bird in one quadrant of the room and then look over to another quadrant and they'll be doing exactly the same thing.
Very nice. Let's talk about the dinner show for a little while, which was a huge part of this project for a very long time. It would have cost adults $1.75 to dine there, children $1.25, and there was $1 added on for the entertainment you were getting. And this also made it nice and easy to separate the money that would go to Walt Disney from Stouffer's, who is the one running the restaurant, which eventually became problematic. So basically, Stouffer's was running out through a deal with Disney, as were all the food eateries at Disneyland at the time. But I was surprised to find out that they kind of ran them based on their own decided hours, and this became a huge problem for Walt, which of course it would. Parks open, the food should be open, but that wasn't exactly how it worked, so that became a big issue. But
if a licensee wanted to start the day a little later, even though they were told not to, they could. It wasn't in their best interest because they wanted to make money. But they could have private parties there at their restaurant if they wanted to, which the Stouffer's people were doing, and it was frustrating to all involved because Disney staff still had to be there. It boils down to a lack of control. Walt wanted control over everything at the park, and rightfully so that he's creating kind of one show that he has power over. And so when you have these outside licensees, you lose control. And the Stouffer's was one of the most egregious examples of that. It started out promising. Vernon and Walt seemed to be getting along fine. And I think it was an amicable divorce, but the Stouffer's people were running the first of what were to be three restaurants not very well. That was the Tahitian Terrace. And then they would move over and run the Tiki Room and the Stouffer's lunch at the other side, Stouffer's at the other side, which I think they were running as well, but wasn't working out. Yeah. So that was a dual prong. The first prong being Stouffer's isn't working out. The other prong is this Tiki Room show is getting to be too big for a restaurant, too outrageous, too special, too unique for a restaurant. No one is going to want to leave. No one is going to be able to eat. It was too mesmerizing.
I think you describe it perfectly in the book. If you turn to page 177 and start reading the second paragraph for me, I think that this really gives you a great idea of what this Tiki Room restaurant experience was going to be like.
The restaurant's suggested menu would consist of almond chicken, sweet and sour ribs, and fried shrimp, all common Chinese fare today, but considered exotic enough in 1962 to seem right at home in a South Seas hideaway. Meals were set at $1.75 for adults and $1.25 for children, with $1 added to each ticket to cover the show, actively separating Wed's Take, that was Walt's company, Wed's Take from Stouffer's as it related to entertainment. On arrival, guests would find their meal waiting for them at their assigned table and were expected to finish the main course within 30 minutes. Ugh. Shortly before the show began, coconut angel cream cake would be served, with the expectation guests would have it finished once the lights came up, at which time staff would quickly herd them out in order to prep for the next meal service. Speedy turnaround was crucial, with many a discussion to follow regarding how to amiably unglue patrons from their seats should they choose to dawdle. Between meals, staff would only have about 15 minutes to set up for the next.
I find this fascinating because I don't know if this was a thing that existed up to this point, but I feel like this is pretty commonplace today, especially if you think of like a Disney cruise line. Like that animator's palette, they definitely have beats that they're hitting as far as the entertainment happening around you and what course of the meal you're on. And even in the parks, like this is just such a normal thing today. And I don't know if necessarily the Enchanted Tiki Room invented this, but it's one of the earliest versions of it I've ever heard before.
I come from the school where I want to dawdle when I eat. I don't want to be pushed out, but yeah. So this was aggressive, and they needed to move patrons from that restaurant. It became more and more clear that good luck, and if you're not going to be able to move patrons from the restaurant, you're not going to make as much money. And Walt, again, with Stouffer's not working out, and Walt going, this thing is getting too grandiose. What would happen if we moved the tables out and added more seats. How many people can get in there? And then Walt, with the promise that you could do 3 shows an hour as opposed to 1 show every meal service. Yeah, the writing was on the wall. If this show works, this is going to be a huge moneymaker, just as a solo show.
Now, Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, I think a lot of people, when they think of the music, think of the Sherman Brothers. But the reality is that it goes back to a studio composer named George Bruns, who received an Oscar nomination for his work on Sleeping Beauty. Also wrote The Ballad of Davy Crockett, a huge hit for Disney. Yo-Ho, Yo-Ho, A Pirate's Life for Me. And yeah, so he was really in charge of the music for most of the project.
Yeah. He did write. He wrote the score for Yo Ho 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 Ho.
And Extensio did the lyrics. Yeah.
Right. To be clear, the Shermans came in very, very late when it was all about like how do we sell this now as a show, and the show needs an opening number, which it didn't have before. Again, this was going to be just a happening. So it was along with John Hench. It was just imagined as a 3-song act sort of happening, and those were not original songs. And then once it became clear, like we need to tie this thing in a bow and have the MCs start it with a song, that's when the Sherman Brothers came in, and they came in late. This whole idea was a last minute thing, and it became an utterly iconic Disneyland tune. And I always tell people, if you really listen to the song, you can see what they're doing, which is like, okay, everybody, this is what this is. It's a funny show. We're in a tropical hideaway. The birds are going to sing words. The flowers are going to croon. We're going to be silly. It's going to get daffy. And the stage was set. So that's what they did. We're going to tell jokes.
I loved your comparison to musical theater and the first song in a musical and its job of setting the stage, essentially. And that's exactly what this does. It was also inspired by Hello Everybody, a song that opened the Golden Horseshoe Revue at Disneyland, which, fun fact, was the first original tune written for Disneyland. And so Walt kind of saw that concept. It was the concept of, what is this? Let's explain what it is right at the top so there's no confusion. Bring in the Sherman Brothers. They do their magic. By the way, you said they were brought in late, but I think even more accurately, they were brought in after the date at which the attraction should have opened already.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this was not going to open on time. It was not going to open when they wanted it to. It was supposed to open when the Tahitian Terrace opened. Yeah, no way. It was, and part of that was not necessarily because things weren't working technically, though there was an issue. No, actually, things were working technically. It was because Walt was having so much fun. It was like, we're going to just keep working on this because this is just so much fun, and we can shape it into something even more weird and daffy. But yeah, eventually you need to open the thing. And come the following whatever summer, it was like, it's time. We have to. And Walt was happy with it. And also, Walt could work. Walt was Walt. He could work on something till he felt it was ready. We don't have that today.
I want to talk about Legends of the Enchanted Island, because I had never heard at all that Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, they wanted to do a version of it for the New York World's Fair, which of course is where he was premiering Lincoln and Carousel of Progress and the Ford Magic Skyway. And eventually It's a Small World, which I want to get to because that story of why that kind of came to be is amazing. But let's start with the Legends of the Enchanted Island.
What can you say about that? It was, okay, well,
actually, just go to page 254 and read from there, because it's kind of the perfect, once again, insane description.
How this version differed had everything to do with theatricality. In Legends of the Enchanted Island, there would be supplemental lighting, projection, wind, and fire effects, the most impressive addition being a series of spectacular water features. Guests would be met with a giant curtain of water shot up from multiple jets fronting the stage, yet to reveal a large central pool surrounded by a lush island garden on descending. Rain would fall on stage during the show's climactic storm, and once concluded, 2 waterfalls on each side of the theater would magically part to reveal theater exits. Even then, Disney Imagineers had one last trick up their sleeves. As breathlessly described in their pitch book, there is no visible means of crossing the pool of water to leave the building. Suddenly, from beneath the stage, a bridge appears. Automatically, it glides out to extend across the water, and guests walk right over the sea, directly through the waterfall and out of the theater. Additional elements would further separate this version from California's, notably its outdoor setting, tiki figures that rose from beneath island foliage, and an upstage volcano that promised to do what volcanoes were meant to do, erupt, turning the placid river waters into a flaming sea of fire. No need for concern, as Legends of the Enchanted Island would conclude, with the storm clouds parting to reveal a glorious rainbow arching across the sky.
So this was considerably different from Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, even taking the restaurant element out of it. But they were trying to get this for the New York World's Fair. So like all this happening, semi around the same time. Here's what cracks me up. So they wanted Coca-Cola to sponsor it, and Coca-Cola didn't want to, correct?
Yeah, it wasn't in their wheelhouse.
It wasn't in their budget to do it.
Yeah, it wasn't in their budget.
Okay. And that is partially, perhaps this is taking too much of a deep dive here, but like, so Pepsi comes along and is like, we want this ride that essentially becomes It's a Small World. And part of the reason Walt says yes, which he doesn't need to because he already has like 3 major projects going on, is to kind of stick it to Coca-Cola for saying no for the Tiki Bird project and saying, sure, Pepsi, we'll do this thing for you.
Well, we don't know that for sure, but it's sure that's the fun thing about writing a book is when you start nailing down the dates and times of things, a story appears that never had been revealed before. And it really does look like when Coca-Cola came along, when Pepsi came along, it's like, oh, we'll show you. We've got Pepsi now. But I'm going to back up and push back on a little of what you just said. So this Legends of the Enchanted Tiki Room show that was planned for New York was the exact same. Well, it was the same show, only it was on a stage with some additional fun water effects. It's the exact same show. And so part of me thinks, thank God it didn't happen because it wouldn't have worked. It's these, one of the main reasons the Tiki Room is so unbelievably enchanting is its intimacy. You are very close to the birds, but throw the birds up on a stage in a 200-seater, and those birds are pinpricks. No.
So this wasn't the 4-quadrant thing. This would have been kind of a proscenium stage.
This was a stage show with a water curtain and some fun, weather effects. But imagine it, the Tiki Room, but pushed back into a stage setting. How is that going to work? So it's a mixed blessing. It's great that it didn't happen because it would have not worked. Also, it wouldn't have. It was already a pre-existing show at Disneyland, and the best thing about the New York World's Fair shows is other people's money could pay for these attractions, and then they move to Disneyland where they can continue on to enchant people that go to Disneyland. The Tiki Room as the stage show would not have been able to do that. But yeah, a wackadoodle side thing to just keep the Imagineers busy before they got their next assignment. I don't know why, but yeah, they started to develop that. But like so many things at Imagineering, you try, didn't happen.
So the attraction does officially open on June 23rd, 1963. People love it, but I also love the fact that even though people loved it, they got a little note from the audience, which was they wanted a Barker bird essentially out front to let people know what the attraction was really. And this lasted for about 6 years and was solely based on customer feedback. And I certainly never witnessed this in person, but I can definitely remember seeing like Disneyland TV specials where they highlight this Barker bird. And so I feel like it is kind of visually iconic with the attraction.
Yeah, that would be Juan outside. Same voice as Wally Bogue, still cracking the same jokes. That Barker bird carried over to Disney World as well. Yeah, so that was one of those, again, ridiculous myths that perpetuated because one person that seems to have some say at the company says it, and then all the Disney fan boys and girls and others spread it like wildfire. So, and that was, oh, well, we put the bird out there and we had to remove it because he was causing a traffic jam. No, they didn't move him away because he was causing a traffic jam. If he was causing a traffic jam and that was a problem, you'd think he would have been moved after a week or two, or top maybe 3 or 4 or 5 months. He was there for 6 years. The reason he was removed is because he was a maintenance nightmare. He was high up, so if he did need to be fixed, you have to get a ladder. He had to be fixed all the time. He was an outdoor bird, so the heat and the smog, and again, back in 1960s, the smog was a thing. I remember it, especially Orange County. It was dirty. It was a dirty, no blue sky world over at Disneyland. Tinkerbell flew over the castle and coughed. So the bird got dirty. His fur had to be replaced. His fur was tearing when there was rain, which we did have back in the 60s. He was not protected. They had actually put out an umbrella, like literally grab an umbrella and put it over the figure. So yeah, he was the fur would break, so his mechanical chest plate would be opening and closing like the gill of a shark, which was, I've seen footage of it, utterly creepy and horrifying and would make any child cry for a week. So no, he was removed because he was a nightmare to fix. And by the time they removed him, they didn't need him to sell the show. People knew the Enchanted Tiki Room.
Now, eventually, Disney Productions did purchase WED Enterprises. WED Enterprises, of course, is what is known as Walt Disney Imagineering today. Before that, It was Walt Disney Enterprises, then Disney Incorporated, then WED Enterprises. But in any case, in 1965, Disney Productions buys WED Enterprises, which makes this an e-ticket attraction at that point, because before that, it was like separate admission, correct?
Yeah, you had to actually buy a separate ticket at the attraction, where you now buy Dole Whip, or did. You had to buy a ticket to get in. And back then, even though it was a $1 something, but that was a lot of money back then. But worth it.
It was individual Lightning Lane before individual Lightning Lane.
Yeah, buy a ticket, show up, yeah.
And of course, Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room has had various iterations around the world, and, some of them infamous at this point. But I want to stick with Disneyland for a second, because it is one of those attractions that I feel like you're constantly hearing might be in trouble. And for a long time, they've talked about making changes to it. I had never heard about this one, though. In the 1980s, they were talking about Cafe Rainforest, a 1930s era nightclub featuring the voice of Bette Midler as a bird.
Yeah, so Bette Midler was in her glory. She was running the company. Not literally, but, every movie she was doing well. And so they thought, let's ramp her into this new project, this Cafe Rainforest, which was sort of a cheeky sort of cabaret style show with, imagine all of the Birdmobile birds being like Mr. Peanut top hat, monocle wearing birds. And she would be the MC. And it was like, a goofy cabaret show. Didn't last very long, thankfully.
Well, it didn't exist, right? You mean the concept didn't last? Or okay,
yeah, the concept didn't last.
Okay. Yeah. But it was Cafe Rainforest, so it was going to go back to that original idea of being a cafe?
Well, no, that was just the title for it. But, but that's a good question. I do not know if it was going to be an eatery or not. I don't think it was. I think it was just going to be a show. But cafe being, kind of that the cabaret, German cabaret nightclub sort of thing. A nightclub, kind of a nightclub experience.
Gotcha. So that didn't happen. Fast forward to the next decade, and there was a discussion about making this a Lion King-centric tiki room, essentially.
That concept didn't last very long either, because they were like, wait a minute, the tiki room, the space is too small for this grandiose Lion King feeling we want. We can get an animatronic Simba up there on the fountain, but we don't have room for much of anything else. So, that eventually morphed into, two things. One is the stage show, which was amazing. And also, now you can go to Animal Kingdom and other venues and see their big Lion King pageant in a stage setting that feels more appropriate for that sort of outdoorsy, grand feeling. So yeah, thankfully that didn't happen. And again, I was like, please don't, no, just leave the tiki room alone. It's a sacred space. It is Walt's, one of the few remaining Walt areas that was Walt's stomping ground. When you sit down in the tiki room, chances are that Walt was sitting right in that same seat, sitting there with VIPs, showing off his baby, something he was very, very proud of. And I will argue, it's like in my introduction, I talk about the idea that there are people that will always say Disneyland is not a museum; it's meant to change. Walt wanted it to change. Walt wanted it to get better. That is all true and right. Imagineers fight for it to be relevant. Some things just go out of style, but the Tiki Room actually, and that again, Walt. The Disneyland is not a museum, and yet the Tiki Room deserves a place in one. It's that important. It's such a piece of pop culture history. It is a pop culture masterwork, as important to the park as the castle itself, and as personal to Walt's sensibility as anything, as Main Street USA. So attention needs to be paid. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I want people to recognize this is important and it needs to remain.
Yeah, I get both sides of that coin there. My thinking has always been, I'm kind of okay with anything happening to Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room outside of Disneyland. I do think Disneyland's needs to exist. But if Magic Kingdom were to say we're replacing it, my heart wouldn't break nearly as much. I'd be like,
no. What Disneyland's version is the one that needs to be preserved because that's Walt's footsteps, and there are still pieces in there that go all the way back to 1963.
Yeah,
that is the shape and form of it. The one in Florida is lovely, but it's too big. It's not as intimate. I think it suffers because of that. Yeah, the Tiki Room at Disneyland is its own little shrine to Walt, and it should remain as such. I've always thought maybe you could if you want to shape shift it for a new audience, you could keep the show, but maybe add some context, a little pre-show or some sort of small presentation before that locks it into the production that is so very close to Walt's heart.
Which they've kind of done with Walt Disney's Carousel of Progress.
Yeah, and actually they did it. They recently did it to Hall of Presidents. Right before the Hall of Presidents begin, they say this show is dedicated to Walt Disney, who had this idea, and this is why he had the idea, and blah 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 blah. When you ground it in that, I think it gives an in for new generations of park goers to respect and relish what they're about to see.
You did say, leave the Tiki Room alone, but I will push back on that a little bit because I feel like they left it alone a little too much. It was falling apart. But thankfully, a man named Michael Eisner came along and in 2005 did a major upgrade to it for the 50th anniversary of Disneyland. And this is really where it got a lot of necessary love at this point. None of those new iterations came about, but it was kind of just falling apart, wasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was a mess. It was neglected. And that was there was a whole handful of years where it's just oh, poor Imagineering must have 3 people working there and they're only cleaning up the bathrooms. There was nothing happening at Imagineering because management didn't care. But for the 50th anniversary of Disneyland, they did care, and the Tiki Room got some TLC. It did get amended. One of the 3 numbers was removed, the Baccarat. It's a beautiful number, but it slowed the pacing of the show down. There's no reason to not bring it back if you dress it up in a different way. But that was done to keep, the MTV generation of low attention spans sated so that they could enjoy the show and not get bored, because that did slow it down.
And I will say, having done the Enchanted Tiki Room many times, I have never seen it in bad shape. I've only done it continuously, regularly since past 2005. I moved to LA in 2006. Of course, I experienced it at Walt Disney World as a kid, but I wasn't paying that much attention. So it's always looked good the amount of times I've done it. I do feel like they keep it up really well these days.
I think they do, yeah.
In 2018, we even got an edition of Rosita making an appearance in the Tropical Hideaway, which I guess is where that little pavilion outdoor seating area would have been back in the day, right?
And yeah, that's true. That whole eating area back there has kind of come back to a kind of a closer rendition of what it used to be way back when. It's better dressed up. It looks like it belongs to Adventureland. It's funny that, Rosita, it's one of those things where, yes, Rosita shows up as the bird, but and it's kind of cute and adorable that she's there, and it's reverential and sweet, but it also, her being called out in the original show was just a side joke and didn't allude to the fact that she actually existed at all. It was a joke, and it wasn't a concern. It wasn't a literal concern. It was a throwaway joke. They've actually taken that joke literally and created her as an actual character, which kind of deflates the joke completely. But it's a cute little addition. It's fine.
They've created the Tiki Room theme park universe with the addition of Rosita.
Now Rosita is actually a real character. Go figure.
Before I let you go, of course, we're getting ready for an update to the country bears at Magic Kingdom. And, there are always these rumors about the Tiki Room. Of course, a huge part of these changes is due to sensitivity issues and just the changes of the time. Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, does not escape from that sort of look or deeper look at it as well. I mean, how much trouble do you think Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room is currently in, or do you think avoiding a pretty major change, considering Jungle Cruise just went through it, Country Bears is going through it, Splash Mountain went through it? Where do you think it is on the list?
It's why I wrote the book. It's like, don't screw with it. Like, it's fine. It's fine the way it is. If you want to put a disclaimer saying, okay, some of this might be a little culturally inauthentic, but calm down. It was meant to send, ripples of joy through the world. The Tiki movement is naive, but it comes from the heart. Put a little sign out there and then leave it. People need to calm down a little bit.
I don't disagree with you. I'm saying how realistically.
I hope that my book is read and sends a message saying it's fine. It's Walt. Leave it. I hope that they leave it alone. And if they don't, it's a sad day. And I do end the book with a poignant little note saying there are things out of our control.
You know what? Don't even. That's how we're gonna end the podcast. I want you to read the last page of your book.
I can't. Okay, Jeff, I can't read it without crying. Seriously.
Do you want me to read it?
I'd rather you read it.
Okay, yeah. I'm gonna read it because it's really beautiful. As is true with every human endeavor, Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room won't be around forever. Whether its demise is caused by a fire, flood, or nuclear disaster, or comes about in a far more predictable way, such as the space being converted into a stroller parking lot, the attraction will always be one of Walt Disney's most significant achievements. As popular tastes change and tech breakthroughs continue to drain the experience of much of its perceived magic, the possibility of a future meet and greet with a wrecking ball grows ever more plausible. But there's hope. If a pageant of automatons emerging from a 17th century mechanical clock in Alsace, France, can continue to charm an international audience centuries after debuting, there's reason to believe Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room can reach a similar milestone. It certainly deserves to. If not, at least the words of MC Pierre will remain, as spoken from atop his perch at the end of the show. The macaw's parting wish will have then gained a level of poignance his handlers never intended. Bonsoirs et madames, it's time to say adieu. But we hope you will always remember the amazing things which happened here in Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room.
Eek.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to end the book. So, yeah, I'm no BS. It's a great book. It is a deep dive. Folks, if you can believe it, we have just touched the surface of the amount of information in this book. It's called Before the Birds Sang Words. I will include a link in this episode's description so you can grab it for yourself. Ken, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. I know we went for a while here, and it's a fascinating read.
One final thought. I was struggling to find this stupid little word at the beginning of the podcast, and it was consequential. It is the most consequential attraction at Disneyland. That is why the book was written. So, again, thank you for having me. A total delight chatting with you. You are a fellow spirit in nerddom, as far as I'm concerned. I say that with kindness. And it was great to have time to spend with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. Don't miss any future episodes by subscribing and following Disney, with a Z, coast to coast on your favorite podcast app, where episodes are available 24/7. This episode has been executive produced by Jeffrey Riccio. Gain rewards like Jeffrey, including access to never-before-heard episodes and live stream Ask Me Anythings, by visiting the Patreon link in this episode's description. And thanks to AvidFan3510 for leaving a 5-star rating and review saying, informative and wildly entertaining. Just discovered the show through a friend referral. Obviously, fans of Disney parks will enjoy it, but Jeff also welcomes influential figures, industry professionals, and historians to give a full perspective on not only the hot topics of the time, but relevant topics that have had an impact on Disney parks and the industry. Love the interview with a longtime technician and animator all about audio animatronics. The House of Mouse headlines also keep me up to date not only with what's happening in my backyard, but parks around the world. Great for planning. Thank you so much for that review. Leave a review wherever you listen to the podcast, and you may just hear it read on a future episode. Until next time, anything you need can be found in this episode's description, from additional information and links discussed in this episode found in the show notes, including a link to the book, to the DCTC hotline where you can leave a voicemail and be heard on a future episode, contact info to reach me, access to the show's official website, some free gifts from me to you, and so much more. So be sure to check out this episode's description. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!